Go. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Will Moss. I'm the CEO of HBCU Connect, and I am super excited to have you all join us for the GitHub HBCU Connect virtual leader panel and tech talk. So this evening, we're going to introduce you to the GitHub team. We'll run through the agenda. I'm going to introduce our first speaker and the main host for the event up next. But I want to thank you all for coming, first of all. GitHub has some great opportunities. We're excited to not only present the opportunities, but give you all the chance to meet the team, to hear from the team. We're going to have a panel discussion where I'll sort of be a representative of the candidates and ask some good questions to our panelists who have graciously spent their time, coming to the event to share their experiences at GitHub. But without further ado, let's start off and let me introduce you to Gabby McDermott. So Gabby, if you'd like to take over with the agenda.
Yes. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Gabby McDermott. You may have received an email from me. This is the face that goes along with that name. So let's level set on what we're going to talk about this evening. We're going to have a welcome, which is what Will and I are doing right now. Then we're going to have an overview of GitHub, give you guys some insights into what it means to work here, what it means to be a hubber. That's what we call employees here at GitHub. We're going to do a really cool tech demonstration, and then we're going to pass it over to our GitHub leaders to have them talk, give some insights, answer some questions, and then we're going to have a close towards the end where, the party will end. But just for today, right? Because there's always fun when it comes to GitHub. Okay. So that's a little bit about myself. To give some more context, I'm a program manager in our talent acquisition team. I started here at GitHub. Wow, 3 years ago, actually. Time flies when you're having fun. I'm currently based out of Dallas, and a part of my role, the biggest part of my role, is engaging with external organizations such as HBCU Connect to really get GitHub in front of some amazing talent, such as you all, in order to bridge the gap between the amazing talent that we know is existing in the market to our roles here at GitHub. So now I'm going to pass it over to one of our fearless leaders on the line, Sharanya, to run us through an overview of GitHub. Sharanya, over to you.
Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Will, for hosting this event and connecting with all this talent. I'm super excited about this talk and panel discussion. I know it might be late for a few of you, so bear with me. The presentation should be quick. We'll get to the exciting part, the Q&A with the panel. So today, I'm going to talk about or make an attempt at talking about what it is like to work at GitHub, and also give you a quick walkthrough of how we at GitHub build GitHub with GitHub. I know it's a mouthful, but we do use GitHub internally to build GitHub. I'll also outline a key core value that's part of our engineering culture, and I'll let you in on a secret around the master plan for GitHub. So just for us. My name is Sharanya Dodapaneni. I'm the VP of Engineering for GitHub Enterprise Products. Let's get into the presentation. What you see here, this is GitHub. It's basically a Ruby on Rails monolith. That's the technology that we use. We also use React for our front end. The monolith basically supports around 2,000 plus services. It's a massive scale. From a employees perspective, we have about 1,500 engineers. GitHub is much larger than that, but engineering is the majority workforce. GitHub is an engineering company, and it is engineering led. Next slide, please. GitHub has been growing ever since we had the first commit in 2008. We have about 100 plus million GitHub users today. So if you ever used GitHub, you are one of those 100 plus million users. Thank you for being GitHub's customer there. Just to explain a little bit around how GitHub scale works, we host about 420 plus million repos on GitHub. So that's like source code from companies to individual users to students, you name it. Everybody has repos on GitHub. We also have 4.3 billion API requests that come in per day. That's a massive scale. Internally within GitHub, we have about 8,000 plus deployments that we do over a year. So we're continuously deploying, making changes so that you're delighted and have the best developer experience possible. Next slide, please. Thank you. At GitHub, what do we care about? We care about availability and performance. Availability is job number one for all of us. This is making sure we keep our product up and running for our customers. Performance is also very important. I just talked about the API request scale, which is about 4.3 billion API requests per day, which means that we have to make sure that our APIs perform. Otherwise, we'll have many, many unhappy customers. Scale and security is also a top priority for us. With 100 plus million users, scale is important for the entire product. On the security front, our CTO, Mike Hanley, always asks this question in town halls and large engineering meetings, which is raise your hand if you're on the security team. Essentially, all of engineering is on the security team because when we build our product, security is always top of mind. We want to make sure that our customers' data is secure. We also are high about productivity and collaboration. That's our high priority. We want to make sure that we roll out product features that enable productivity and collaboration as you build code and roll out your apps. That's at a very high level what we care about at GitHub when we build the product. Next slide, please. So I promised I'll share a core value of GitHub. We have many of them, but ship to learn is one thing that you'll hear constantly from our engineers, and it's embedded in our engineering culture. When I say ship to learn, what it means is we don't believe in shipping features in a waterfall process. We believe in breaking down things into smaller chunks so that we quickly roll things out, ship it, and learn from it. The key part here is not shipping, but it's about learning from the process and outcomes. So it's a learning culture. We believe that strongly within our engineering teams. Next slide, please. All right, it's time for revealing the master plan, I guess. Drum roll, please. At GitHub, we strongly believe in providing the best developer experience possible. So along those lines, our master plan, next slide, please. Not a surprise, build happy developers. How do we do that? Both within the company as well as outside, our focus is on making sure that we listen to our developers, get their feedback, and our roadmaps are geared towards making sure that we address that feedback. And that's how we believe that we create the best communities for our developers out there to roll out the best products and apps. Next slide, please. All right, so you heard a little bit about how we build GitHub, what our core values are. I wanted to share some quotes from our engineers. We call them hubbers, by the way, and see what they have to say. GitHub, we strongly believe in making sure that we provide a supportive and inclusive environment so that you can thrive and do your best work. Next slide, please. GitHub is a remote-first company, which means that we support both asynchronous and synchronous conversations. We have many, many tools that support all these communications. We also believe in supporting diverse backgrounds. As part of that, GitHub has employee resource groups. We call them communities of belonging. Depending on the background that you might have, feel free to join any of them to get the right support. In addition to the employee resource groups, we have many Slack channels where employees share their passions and hobbies. Like, for example, we have a coffee Slack channel where people actually exchange coffee beans. And we have a Slack channel where it's called Anime, where people talk about the latest anime shows. We also have a Slack channel for dog lovers out there. It's called Dog Cam. and you'll see a lot of cute dog pictures. So the whole point here is even within a remote company, we enable different support frameworks to build that culture. Next slide, please. Besides all of this, you also get a chance to work with talented engineers, very approachable colleagues. You can always raise your hand and ask for help. In addition to that, you saw the scale at which GitHub works, which means that you get to work on a lot of complex technical challenges, which I think is key for career growth. Next slide, please. All right, hopefully that was insightful and hopefully it gave you a glimpse of what it is like to work at GitHub. Now I'm going to walk you through a quick tech demo to show what a product from GitHub looks like. If any of you have watched the Universe keynote from our CEO, Thomas Donkey, he announced GitHub Spark, which is basically an AI tool that can be used to create apps using entirely natural language. So let me bring up my screen. If you give me a second. And I'll walk you through it. Can folks see that okay?
Yep, just popped up.
Perfect. Okay. So right now, GitHub is what, 100 plus million users, but our goal is to get to 1 billion developers. How do we do that? Not everybody is tech savvy. So how do we be inclusive with our products? And this is where GitHub Spark comes into play. So people without tech background, you can just use natural language to build your apps. The interface is quite simple. It's not an IDE. You don't have to set up any environment. All you do is launch your browser window, and you can see, you can select any of the language models that you want. These are some past apps that I was just playing around with. But let's get started with building a quick, simple app. To speed up the demo, I have some prompts on the side, so you'll see my mouse going back and forth. But, oh, sorry, that's my bad. I had the wrong copy paste going there. There you go. So we're going to build a flashcard app. I'm keen on learning Spanish, so let's build that. It's demo time. Hopefully demo gods are happy with me and let me finish the demo without any issues. I guess they are talking to the Oracle.
Is this live on the site now, or is this something that you all are still working on?
This is live and it's open for waitlist. So Will, you can just go to the website and sign up for the waitlist.
Awesome.
So here you go. What did it take, like a few seconds? It just popped up and you can see I have a card here. If I click on it, that's what it means in English. I can go to the next one. What does that mean? Thank you. There you go. So I'm already learning Spanish, but maybe I can make the card look a little better. So I'm going to ask for a few more changes, which is basically I'm asking for a cooler gradient and like a thicker border so that it's visually pleasing.
So while that's happening, I know some people are probably wondering, does this export to different platforms or devices, mobile, web, that kind of thing, or?
Right now, the apps run on a browser, so you should be able to run it on your mobile device or your iPad. Yeah, any of those.
Awesome.
So if you see, it did change the border as I requested. Also, if you are, let's say, a Spanish native speaker, and by the way, I don't speak Spanish, but I'm going to attempt at putting in. So what I asked was, not just Spanish, but can I pick a language of my choice? So it's going to add a couple of language options for the flashcards. So maybe I want to learn French instead of Spanish. I can do that too. And as this gets generated, there you go. So you can see it gives me options here. I can pick French and oh, guess not. Well, that's a hiccup, but let's keep moving. What you notice here is as I was asking for changes, those changes get made, and there's also code being generated in the background. This is all the code that's powering the app here. And then the other thing that you notice here is it keeps track of the history of how your app is evolving. So it's kind of like versioning, right? So you can always go back to a previous version. Like, for example, something happened with the language choice that I requested. Maybe my Spanish prompt was not perfect, I guess. So you can always go back to your previous one to a better functioning version. So you can do that. So another thing that you could do is as you build these apps out, you can actually share this with your friends. So here is the share link. And essentially what happens is it generates a link and you can pass it on to whoever, and folks can actually fork it and build their own experiences on top of what you've already built. So there's option for doing that as well. The point here is it took me a couple of minutes to generate the app and up and running, and you can share it broadly and folks can add on top of it. And you don't have to know to write code or a single line of code there. All right, that's the demo from me, and I will stop sharing and I will hand it back to, I guess, Gabby.
Yes, you will. Wow, that's really, really exciting. As someone that is not technical in any way, shape, or form, I now can call myself a developer. It doesn't really get much better than that, all right? So now I would like to invite all of our leaders to join us, and I'm also going to call in Will to help with our next section of the presentation, which is our audience Q&A. So Will, team, over to you.
Awesome. Okay, so what I like to do, so I'll kind of moderate the discussion, but what I like to do is give, before we start into the live Q&A and some of the questions that were already pre-submitted, I like to give some context, right? So let's go through introducing everyone that's going to participate in the panel from the GitHub side, starting with Jacob Alexi. Jacob, if you're ready. And is that Jacob or Jakub?
It's Jacob, although I was born in Poland, and so technically it's Jakub. But I've lived in America a long, long time, so I just go by Jacob now. Nice to meet you all. I'm looking forward to conversation over the next hour here. I've been at GitHub about 5 years now. Prior to that, I was actually at Microsoft and also working on developer tools, which is just a big passion of mine. I love building software for other developers. I think that they're the best customer in the world because they are extremely demanding. They know what they want, but they're also extremely forgiving because they know how hard it is to build some of these things. And so I've always enjoyed that as a customer base. And I think, honestly, at GitHub, can you imagine a better place to be for building tools for developers, right? We're in the middle of it. So extremely, humbled and proud to be at this company and working on the things that we're working on. And yeah, just looking forward to answering your questions and talking more about what I do and what we do at GitHub.
Awesome. So as I introduce each of you, I want to ask a few context questions for our participants just to kind of know. So for you, I see you're Senior Vice President of Engineering. What are some of the other roles that you've held leading up to this role that you have now at GitHub?
So, I mean, if you go all the way back, I started as a college hire at Microsoft as an individual contributor. So I was a developer coding away for probably the first 7 or 8 years of my career. I was an individual contributor. I moved into a first line manager role I was in that role probably for another 6 years or so before making the jump to like a director role. And then from director to a VP at GitHub, and then a senior VP at GitHub.
And so what does your team look like? So is your team comprised of engineers, QAs, other managers? What does your team look like?
Yeah, my team is, so like my direct folks are mostly VPs reporting to me, or senior directors that own other large organizations that make up GitHub. And then I do actually have one distinguished engineer reporting to me as well, who is sort of like almost chief architect for GitHub, has his fingers in sort of many pieces. The broader team is composed of, yeah, lots of directors, managers, individual contributors. The overall team size, I think, for me, is about 620 people or so. And yeah, I mean, we do everything from some UI development in my organization. I'm mostly actually like a platform and infrastructure organization, but we do have some UI development for sure, kind of in my enterprise team. And then really lots of different stacks, lots of different technologies. GitHub is a little bit of a smorgasbord of different pieces, just as we've grown organically. And so there's a lot of different technologies that we use.
That kind of leads into the next question I was going to ask is what technologies and reoccurring hiring needs do you typically have? I know this event is primarily going to be for software engineers in the audience, but what kind of skills and things do you all typically look for the software engineers that come into the company?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in, so let's call it sort of fundamentals, right? And so being just a good engineer and being able to learn new things, right? In our profession, we do have to learn our entire career. Things are changing all the time. And so for me, it's really evaluating somebody's passion and ability to learn and willingness to learn and grow, and a lot less about a particular language or tool set or experience they've had for, I would say, the vast majority of roles. Occasionally, we do look for a very specific talent set if we have a need in, a very niche area of GitHub. But I would say those are the exceptions. And more often than not, we're just looking for great, talented engineers that can bring that passion and whatever the experience they've had into GitHub, and just can continue to round out and sort of fit with the overall culture of what we're trying to build, which really is folks just passionate about building great tools for engineers.
Awesome. So my favorite question that I'm going to ask each person on the panel, and that is, for you personally, what is it that you like most about working for GitHub?
I think it's two things. One is what I mentioned, which is what we build and who we build for. I mean, I think the mission is noble. And, if you think about the work that people do on GitHub, I feel like, I'm a part of that, right? And all the amazing things that developers do around the world, I get to play a small part in that. And then I'll cheat. I think there's a second answer, which is the people that I work with. That brings me a lot of joy, and being surrounded by people that I respect and that I enjoy working with. And that's really important to me personally. And so that's the other aspect.
Awesome. So Jacob, let me thank you for being one of our panelists and giving us a little bit of context about yourself, your role, and your thoughts about GitHub. So with that, allow me to introduce our next speaker, who you all have already heard of, but let's get into a little bit more of the day in the life and responsibilities of Sharanya. So Sharanya, if you'd like to kind of reintroduce yourself and talk a little bit about your role there at GitHub.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I'm Sharanya Dodapaneni, and I lead the engineering for GitHub Enterprise products. What that means is essentially when you go to github.com, the cloud offering, and a lot of the supporting things like billing, licensing, the platform that enables enterprise administration. GitHub also has a server product. So my team is responsible for the server product as well. So mostly engineering, that's all engineering. And on the personal front, I joined GitHub about a year ago. I'm actually coming up on my 1-year anniversary in December. But it's been a wild ride where I've learned a lot. And the exciting part, like Jacob said, is what you build has such a broad reach. And when folks ask me, where do you work? And I say GitHub, I don't even have to explain what the product is. that is an amazing gratification to have. And also, I personally am very passionate about building inclusive and diverse teams. And part of that, I lead the hiring for engineering at GitHub. And that gives me an opportunity to connect with folks like you. So I'm definitely looking forward to partnership there.
Awesome. So what was your path or journey to working at GitHub? What were some of the roles that you had that led into the role that you have now at GitHub? And then also I want to ask, what was the deciding factor, when you got that offer from GitHub and you said, you know what, I'm going to join the team at GitHub. What were some of the deciding factors for that
You
decision?
definitely ask hard questions, Will. So my journey, I started as a software engineer, and I think I've been in product engineering pretty much all my professional life. I worked in the consumer product space, so Netflix is an example of that. I worked in fintech or financial industry. Stripe was one of them. I worked in the networking side at Cisco. And then I'm now at GitHub. I think for me, when I pick my role, what matters for me is this the space and product I'm passionate about? And is it solving a real problem? And if I get that connect, I think that's what sells me on like, yes, this is where I want to go work for. And that's, I think, what GitHub got me into. Just because, you see the impact we create. I talked through all of that. And that's what keeps me coming back to work every day.
So I think you have a unique perspective, as you recently joined the team there at GitHub. But now that you're on the team, is there something that you wish you knew, now that you're at the company, something that you wish you knew before you had joined the team there at GitHub?
I guess, one thing is when companies say they're remote first, it's not an easy thing to run a large company as remote first, because I've seen the transition during COVID, the pandemic time, on how companies struggled with it. I was a bit skeptical about how an entire company can be remote. I mean, I've seen the previous companies, and I was very surprised at how well it runs, because pretty much everybody is remote. We get together in offsites in person, but other than that, the day-to-day operations are all run remote. And the way we are able to collaborate, the way we are able to align and make sure we work on the right set of priorities, it's just an amazing machine that's able to run not just within US, right? It's across multiple countries. So that was an amazing aspect that you got to experience it. Not looking in, you probably won't realize it or know about it.
Awesome. This is exactly what I was looking for, some of that insight. So thank you for that. And for you personally, my favorite question, what is it that you like so far most about working at GitHub?
Most about GitHub, I think Jacob already stole some of those, but I'm going to add something on top of it. So GitHub is remote first. I'm a mom, and I have a high schooler, and folks who are familiar with high school, the timings are odd. You're basically chauffeur to your kids. And the flexibility that GitHub offers from a work-life balance perspective is amazing. I get to go pick him up whenever he needs me, and I still get the work done. So I am given a lot of freedom with responsibility, which I think is something invaluable from a just working at GitHub standpoint.
Awesome. So Sharanya, again, thank you for not only the demo, but also for being a part of this panel. I'm sure we're going to have some awesome questions for you as well. So next up, let me introduce our next panelist, who is Anya Haliop, Senior Director of Software Engineering. And please correct me if I mispronounce your last name.
That is perfect. I should always have you announce me. Yeah, so I'm Anya Haliop. I've been at GitHub for just over 2 years. The organization that I lead is Collaboration Workflows. So we're focused really on collaboration and productivity. And that's going to encompass things like issues, projects, docs, discussions, We also focus a lot on accessibility and making sure that all our customer-facing products are accessible. I have teams that are I'm actually based in Canada myself, in Toronto, Canada, but I have teams that are mainly in the US or in Europe. And prior to GitHub, I worked at small companies and at big companies, but I think GitHub is really that sweet spot of like kind of a mid-sized company, but the scale that you have is probably the by far one of the biggest scales of a lot of companies that you would have the opportunity to work on.
What are some of the previous roles that you have held, prior to your current role?
Yeah, so when I first started, I was a software developer, and I forgot, with Jacob or Sharanya mentioned that they were networking. That's how I got my start as well. I used to write routing protocols for the internet, which no one understood when I tried to explain what I worked on. It was like the secret language of the internet. But I enjoyed that a lot. And then throughout my career, I pivoted at some point more when I loved the technical aspects of that, but then I pivoted more to customer facing companies. So I worked for accounting for small businesses. I worked at Uber. I worked at a self-driving startup, and then ended up here about 2 years ago. Yeah.
Awesome. So what's a day in the life like for you in your current role?
A lot of connecting with a lot of people around the world, definitely. And so I find a lot of times my focus is trying to figure out how do we have that right balance of ensuring that what we're building is highly reliable, highly scalable, but doing it in a way so that we can bring it to customers as soon as possible. So in a lot of meetings, trying to make those decisions and try to create the atmosphere for the right decisions to happen.
Awesome. And my favorite question, for you personally, what is it that you like most about working at GitHub?
Can I answer two things? Because one would be the opportunity to work with so many people from different cultures. I really like that coming from Canada. I love that I'm working with people in Germany and working people in the US, working people in France and so forth. And then the second thing is I think every job that you have stretches you in a different way. And so for me at GitHub, I've always done all my leadership in person previously. So it's really enabled me here to be stretching my communication skills that are more like written, more async and so forth. So I've really enjoyed that journey.
Awesome. So again, let me thank all of you for being panelists. We've got a good amount of time for live Q&A and pre-submitted questions for our panel. So allow me to take down my slides and we'll focus on the video of each of you. And to our candidates, feel free to use the chat if you like for me to interject a question that you submit in the chat. And then I'm also going to leverage my notes here from some pre-submitted questions. And to our panelists from GitHub, if you all would please help me out, because I'm going to throw some questions out there that might not be pointed to a specific person on the panel. But if you feel like you have a good answer, please do help me out with that, because we got lots of questions, probably over 40 questions from the candidates prior to the event. And I'm sure some questions will come in from the chat. So I'm going to try to prioritize the questions from the chat so that people can take advantage of this being a live and interactive event. So I see a question already from Jordan in the chat. And the question is, can you tell us more about the teams we would be working with? Do they utilize agile development? So a little bit more about the teams and the development environment.
I can start, and maybe Anya, Jacob, you can chime in. So one thing I wanted to just like quickly set some context on is we're hiring across GitHub, and that means that it's pretty much across all of the product areas at GitHub. Jacob's org, so I am part of Jacob's org. We are hiring for enterprise and platform. We're hiring for Copilot, Anya space. So it's across all the teams. So you get to work on, I would say, backend services, front-end UI work, Copilot even, building AI, which is like the latest innovation, a lot of the newer products. So I would say it's across. And in general, GitHub is all about incremental builds and incremental rollout of features. We don't believe in like large scale 1 year projects. That's not how GitHub typically functions. But again, there are some cultural aspects per team in terms of how they work day in, day out. So some teams might run daily stand-ups. Some teams might use boards for reviewing their backlogs. There is some aspect of team level culture that varies, but in general, it's all about incremental shifts and learn from it. Earlier, I was talking about this ship to learn. That's like a key part of our culture. Anya, Jacob, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add that one thing that Sharanya had mentioned earlier was like, we're using our own tools. So that enables us to be our own testers as well, because, you know, we're developers at the end of the day. So when we're trying to roll out new products or new functionality to customers, we test it out on ourselves. So like my org is responsible for projects. We're using projects for our day-to-day project management. We're using issues when we're trying to create a bug report, or here's a item of work that needs to be done. And I think that gives us that opportunity to much more incrementally work through things, because of the fact that we can start in like our own team, and then we can start in our larger org, and then the whole engineering org before even it goes out to any customer.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to pull from one of my questions that was pre-submitted from our candidates prior to the event. And this one is around AI and the use of AI in software development. So with the rise of AI in software development, how is GitHub adjusting its platform and strategy to integrate and leverage these emerging AI tools? And I think this probably ties into the demo as well as an example of that. But the overall AI strategy and how GitHub is leveraging AI in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think the narrative that Sharanya sort of shared around AI being able to democratize development for a larger audience, right? I think that's a core sort of vision that we have at GitHub of how can we enable even more folks to basically have the idea of being a developer more accessible to them. I think, you know, there was another question in the chat that was like, well, what's the end game for AI for developers, which maybe is a similar question to what you're asking. You know, I think we definitely believe natural language is a big piece of that, right? And how do you incorporate natural language into the daily developer workflow? I think, you know, things we think about a lot is how do we get rid of as much of the toil that exists, right? We all know that when we're building projects, there's elements where there are sort of like novel tasks or interesting problems to go solve. And then there's, I don't know, writing a bunch of unit tests for some boilerplate functions, right? And so how can we bring the power of AI to give developers time back so that they can be really focusing on the highest value problems and not the, you know, the kind of the boilerplate work, right? And so, you know, I think there's a lot to be still done. You know, Spark is a great example of some of the, you know, glimpse at what I think the future could bring. And it's an exciting time, right? I think no one's talking about developers being replaced. I think it's about empowering developers to do even more.
Awesome, love it. So next question is from Adrian from the chat, and that is around something that I think Sharanya touched on earlier with GitHub being a remote first company. So what strategies or tools are being used at GitHub to collaborate effectively in a remote setting? So kind of how does that look? Maybe a peek behind the scenes.
So from a tools perspective, Slack is big at GitHub. A lot of communication happens on Slack. So these could be one-on-one DMs, or it could be group DMs, or we have permanent or temporary Slack channels, which are either project-based or they could be a specific to solve a specific incident that might have happened. So a lot of communication happens on Slack. That's a very critical tool for us. In addition to that, Zoom, of course, that's how we see each other in the box, I guess. And besides that, Google Docs. So we use Google Suite quite a bit, the G Suite tools. So spreadsheets, Google Docs. That's how a lot of our project proposals or architecture layouts are put out, and people add comments, and we collaborate to figure out, is this the path forward we need to take? So those are a few tools. Besides that, we have other tools for operational management and things like that. But essentially, some of these tools, I think these days, folks have exposure to already. So as you get into GitHub, these should be very familiar to you as well.
So you mentioned Google and Google Docs, and there's a question in the chat around how is the GitHub culture different from the Microsoft culture? So I think I'm going to throw this one at Jacob, since you usually work.
I've worked at both for a long time.
So how's the culture different?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say, my personal opinion is probably the biggest difference in culture is around synchronous versus asynchronous work. Microsoft is a very synchronous culture. Even through sort of the time of COVID where it was remote, my perception was that it was still very synchronous, right? Like, yes, people were remotely meeting, but they were still meeting synchronously to try to get things done. And so we definitely see it when we interface with Microsoft, right? Like, we like to lead with documents and documentation and sort of starting there. And oftentimes with Microsoft, it's like, let's get a meeting together and talk about it. And I'm not saying it's wrong, it's just different, right? It's the culture that Microsoft has had for the longest time. I think a lot of that is because it was always in person, right? And I think I talked a lot about the difference, like remote doesn't mean asynchronous, right? Like you can do remote, I argue maybe poorly by having it be too synchronous, right? Because the challenges of remote start to introduce time zones and, the flexibility that Shiranya talked about is only enabled if your workflows and how you work together supports that kind of like more asynchronous culture. So yeah, in the middle of the day, like I'll be honest, I went out for a run at lunch today because I couldn't go in the morning. I had a customer meeting. And so my job affords me that flexibility that I was able to just go and not feel like I was missing something, right? And so I think that's probably like the biggest difference. The only other thing I'll say is, GitHub, even though we have, 1,500 engineers, it still feels a lot like a startup. We're kind of running fast and breaking things. And I'd say generally Microsoft doesn't do that. There are pockets. I mean, it's a big company, but I think a lot of the things that people think about when they think of Microsoft, it is a really well-oiled machine, right? It's a very, it's a mature company that runs really, really well. And I think at GitHub, we tend to sometimes run fast and, break things along the way and then fix them and then, rinse, repeat.
Love it. Love the insight. Appreciate that. So I see some really good questions coming in to the chat. I'm going to try to prioritize that since we're live. And so the next one I want to pull up is from Derek James, and that is to backpedal off of an earlier question. How are the teams organized? Are the teams split up into particular skill sets like front end or back end, or how are the teams organized within your organization? So if anyone, I would default that to Jacob or Anya.
I can jump in and talk because, like Jacob, I think you'll talk a little bit more on the platform teams, which I think will be a little bit different. But for a lot of our more customer-facing teams, I try to at least, I mean, it's going to depend, I think, in a different area, but I try to focus on teams that are more end-to-end so that they can do the front end and they can do the back ends and so forth. I think one area where we differentiate is mobile is usually still more specialized skill set from a full stack developer. So those in my part of the org are separated out. But in general, I'm looking not for an individual engineer to have all the skills, but trying to put together teams of engineers that will enable us to build and ship a feature end to end.
Excellent. So the next question is around what growth looks like from within GitHub. So this question is from Michael. So, what does growth look like within GitHub? How does GitHub support learning opportunities when working with new technologies? or pursuing additional certifications. So I'll throw that one out for one of you all to jump on.
I can
You want to go,
go
Shreya?
ahead, Jacob.
All right, I'll talk about a couple things. So one, I'm a big proponent of, a lot of the learning has to happen on the job, and because that's the majority of the time that you spend. And so how can we find opportunities to continue to grow as engineers in the day-to-day work that we do? And so I think, you learn a lot from your peers. There's just this natural growth that happens as you take on new challenges and learn new technologies. The internal mobility is definitely a thing as well. This idea of like, okay, I've worked on maybe this platform feature for a while, and I'd love to go try more maybe UI development. Can I go move internally and take on a new challenge there? So I think there's kind of a lot of that's just inherent in the work that we do. And there's also sort of additional things. We have a day of learning where I think it's once a month. We have all these like pre-planned sessions that talk about, everything from a technology to this is how you bake a cake, right? And like, people can just share what they want and bring that to GitHub. We also have essentially every year you get, I guess, a stipend or a certain amount of money that you can use for your own kind of learning desires, right? Whether you want to go to a conference, take a class. And honestly, people do that for not even just technology things. People have taken photography classes, or you can take ski lessons, or you can learn Spanish. And so there's a lot of flexibility in how you use those funds. So generally, there's a lot of support within GitHub to continue to learn and grow. And like I said earlier in my intro, that's really the expectation, right? The environment that we work in as developers is constantly changing. And so you have to keep up and you have to keep growing. And one cool thing about GitHub is I think we generally are on the cusp of a lot of things. And so you have an opportunity to learn new technologies as part of your job.
Awesome. So I'm going to pull from one of my pre-submitted questions, and I'm going to actually expand on it just a little bit, because I'm sure everyone wants to know, right? A lot of us, I'm a software engineer as well, so I can relate. But a lot of us have different specialties and different skill sets, right? So one of the overall questions, and I love to hear from each of you all from your different vantage points within GitHub and the different teams that you work on. I love to hear where you're seeing the hiring needs, right? So the types of talent or skill sets or areas of GitHub that are growing that people can look forward to. So Anya, I'll start with you, then Sharanya, then Jacob.
Sure. So I work with Sharanya a lot on our early in profession hiring. And so this is kind of like the next generation of engineers that are going to be at GitHub. And I would say when I'm looking for it, like we had talked about previously of having that kind of like, or really it's about like that learner mindset is like technology is always going to change, right? You might come in as a Python developer, in a year or two, you might need to be learning a new kind of technology. So I know what I'm looking for is someone that's been able to show that they can go through that path of being able to learn a skill and become good at it, but that they still have that open mind and ambition to be like, okay, I'm ready now for the next step. So have that, what I call often like a learner's mindset or a beginner's mindset, because the biggest thing I would say in tech is you don't know what the future is going to be, what are the skills that are going to be important. So it's like you need to be ready to be constantly reinventing yourself and leaning into that and being okay about it, versus like, oh, I've learned it, I'm now an expert, and I'm just going to sit back and coast. You can't coast in tech, from my perspective.
Appreciate that insight. So Sharanya, from your viewpoint, where do you see the organization growing, and what types of talent the GitHub needs to consume?
So I think similar to what Anya just said, we're definitely looking for a lot of early in profession folks. And to reiterate what Anya was saying, the focus is like you should have strong CS fundamentals, right? And it doesn't have to be attached to a specific language or framework, but it's in general, do you understand how languages work? That's the key part. And on top of it, I think it's all about, because we are a remote first company, are you someone who's resourceful? can you raise your hand and ask for help when needed? Because we don't have the hallways where you can find someone to talk to. It's always about, can you speak up and ask the question at the right moment? I think that's the kind of personality you will need to survive. So a lot of that go get it done kind of attitude is key, which I think is not just about coursework. It's about, can you survive in this environment and thrive there? So that's what I would be looking for.
Awesome. And Jacob, from your perspective, where do you see the opportunities and from a hiring perspective there at GitHub?
Yeah, I mean, I think Anya and Sharanya covered the general. Maybe I'd offer just a little bit of kind of advice, right? I think what I care a lot about is folks that don't believe that they've reached their full potential. And what I mean by that is, like, we should always be okay asking a question. We should always be okay recognizing that, yeah, this AI thing, maybe it makes me a better developer. I shouldn't be afraid of it. I should embrace it and try it and learn. Understanding that we're all on a journey, we haven't arrived, right? And so if you have that attitude and that mindset, and you're not sort of like protective and like trying to hide, like, oh, I don't know this thing, I'm afraid to ask, I'm going to spend 3 days searching on Google to try to figure it out instead of just asking my peer who could have told me in 5 minutes. There's something to be said for learning, but it's like, you know, there's a bar. At one point, you should recognize, hey, I'm having a hard time with this. Let's ask for help. And so I think having that sort of an attitude, especially as Sharanya said, with us being remote, where you don't necessarily get those natural opportunities where you're just walking by somebody's office and can chat. Being able and willing to go do that, I think, is just really important to be successful here. And so, just making sure that that's something that I think is top of mind for you, and you just, more than anything, not afraid to admit that you don't know everything. We all don't know everything, and it's totally okay, right? And we recognize that at GitHub, and we want to support a culture where that is accepted, and we're there to help each other.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm seeing some really good questions in the chat, so keep them coming. And if your question is for a specific person on the panel, please include that in your question. So I see a question from Anna in the chat, and it says, how does GitHub prioritize which new features to develop? And can you give or share an example of how user feedback led to an update or enhancement to GitHub? So I'll throw that out there for whoever likes that question the most.
I guess we're all waiting for who's gonna unmute. I can take a quick stab at it. And so the way we tend to prioritize features for our product is we take into consideration customer feedback. So we always have a continuous loop of feedback with our customers. And that is always something we take into consideration, figuring out if we should build A versus B, where is the most pain point, or where is the most customer ask coming from. So that is one key criteria that's taken into account. The other one is our product team, they leverage market research and product research. So this is basically, there are a couple of researchers that they would go out, talk to our users, get their feedback on what do their workflows look like, what are they craving for, where do they have the most pain points. So that user research also feeds into how we shape our product and product experience. Besides that, I think there's also an aspect of innovation. So innovation always doesn't like show up in front of you. You sometimes have to use your, I guess, intuition based on what you see in the market and what you see or hear from customers as you have like multiple conversations. So a lot of that intuition also goes with Copilot, which is our innovation space. The things that I talked about earlier go into the enterprise space, which is more mature. But Copilot, I would say, is more intuition based, and we do a lot of experimentation like A/B testing as well that helps us guide if we've made the right decision or not, or which direction to take. So that's one way of doing it. Did I answer all? I think I heard two-part question there, but
No, I think you covered it for sure. but appreciate that. I mean, this is really good. I mean, I haven't seen this much engagement from a Q&A perspective in a while. So kudos to our candidates. And I'm sitting here thinking about how we're going to try to answer as many of them as we can in the next 20 minutes or so. So I have another great question, and this one may it's more of it's a technical question, but I think it will give us a glimpse of the GitHub culture. And I'm going to default this one to Jacob, I think. And this one is around, Rob asked a question, how are code review conflicts solved in the company? For example, there's nothing wrong with the code. Maybe there's a different approach, fulfills the requirements. Both developers differ in how to write the code or the algorithm, right? So are there coding guidelines that solve, the question? But I think the answer to this question may be more of a cultural thing. So maybe taking you back to when you were writing code, going through code reviews, maybe there was a difference. How does that get resolved at GitHub?
Yeah, I think going back to a little bit to what Sharanya said earlier, a lot of teams work in different ways, right? We actually don't have a super prescriptive way of saying, as a team, you have to operate exactly like this. So I think there'll be some variance. But what I would offer is GitHub foundationally is built on the idea of collaboration. And if you think about the product itself and even the features that are built inside GitHub, they're all about enabling developers to collaborate, right? If you think about the flow of a PR and how it goes through discussions, right? And you're able to comment on every line and, do that fully asynchronously. Also, like, I'm actually a huge proponent and a fan of actual like pairing with somebody, right? And coding together. I think if you do that, it actually that is the code review, right? Like in a lot of ways. In previous to GitHub, my approach with my team was, look, if you paired on something, you don't need another person to code review. That was already the code review, right? You don't need to wait for another approval on your PR. That was enough if the two of you agreed, which was a little bit of an incentive to encourage pairing because I strongly believe in the value of it. I think the conflicts maybe that you're alluding to, I don't think they often happen at that level. I think at least what I see, I mean, I don't usually operate at that day-to-day coding level. What I see is more at the like architectural design level where people have fundamental disagreements about like how we should do this big thing. Yeah, those can be challenging, right? It's asynchronous discussions and documents. It is occasionally synchronously like, hey, we just got to get in a virtual room and hash it out and talk through it. Sometimes you're going to need to escalate and, somebody's just going to have to make a decision. I mentioned earlier, I've got a, distinguished engineer reporting to me. And sometimes it just comes to that, like, hey, we're going to bring in a third party and we're going to decide and we're just going to pick a path. I've lately, I feel like the last few weeks in particular, have been talking a lot about this idea that there's a lot of different options that are good. Mm-hmm. Let's just pick one. Mm-hmm. And focus on it and just make it good, right? You don't need to be perfect. There's probably 12 different ways to do it, but as long as we just pick one and invest in that and do it well, that's good enough, right? We don't have to debate, the 1% difference between 12 solutions. We just need to make a decision and move forward. And I think that's really, really important, is not spending too much time with kind of analysis paralysis of like, well, this one thing might be just a little bit better. Does it really matter in the grand scheme is what we need to ask ourselves.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to pull from one of the pre-submitted questions. And this one actually came for Anya. And that is, with your team spread across countries, how do you ensure they stay aligned and engaged while working on shared goals? Managing remote and global teams must require some specialized approaches. That was the question pre-submitted.
Yeah. And I mean, we talked a little bit about that before on leaning in on the async communications, really leaning in on sharing your information through writing things down. Another thing I would say is that I try to ensure that anytime we are doing meetings that really do require synchronous, like brainstorming and communication, we're really conscious of time zones and trying to, which in itself, it almost feels like a unique skill set of how to try to how to manage time zones, which I've been honing over the last 2 years, of trying to have those communications in person. And I will rotate on, like, sometimes it might be a little bit earlier for some folks in the Pacific West Coast one week. It might be a little bit later in Europe another week, and so forth. One thing that I really like is by having these kind of challenges, I think it actually makes us much better at thinking through what is it that our vision is, what is it that our philosophy is on something, and how do we want to communicate it? Because you don't have those kind of more natural touch points where you're just running into people and you can just talk to people off the cuff. You have to be much more thoughtful of what's the messaging that you want to share and how can you ensure that you're communicating it in multiple different ways so that you don't get in these situations that someone wasn't at a particular meeting because for them it was midnight and therefore they didn't get that information. So we record a lot of meetings, we write a lot of things down, and the original goal might be that this is necessary for that communication when you're spread across different time zones, but it also makes it a lot easier for new folks coming into the org or new folks coming into a particular team, because we do want that have that internal mobility. It makes it a lot easier for them to be able to ramp up. And so that same with folks that are not in your team getting access to that kind of information. So I actually think these kind of constraints end up making us much stronger in these areas.
Awesome. Awesome. I'm going to pull from another pre-submitted question, and this one's for Sharanya. So Sharanya, you've had experience working at other high-profile companies like Stripe and Netflix. How have those varied experiences shaped your approach to leading at GitHub?
I think every job that you have, you take away learnings that you feel like are going to benefit your next job. That's how I take it. So for example, when I used to work at Netflix, Netflix has these, just like GitHub has core values, Netflix also has a few values. One of the values that really stuck with me is freedom and responsibility. And the key part there is when you have teams, you need to empower your leaders, your engineers, so that they are self-enabled to make decisions. They have the right support framework to know that they can think through a framework and actually confidently make a decision and move forward. To Jacob's earlier point about even if it's not 100% accurate, the key thing is you understand the risks and make a call and make progress, and you learn from it if it doesn't work. That freedom and responsibility, I think, is very empowering, and it, I think, builds happier teams because at the end of the day, they feel ownership, accountability, and that brings a lot more productivity than if you control things and you try to do a more top-down approach. So that's one thing that I incorporate in like whatever project that I'm working on or whoever I'm working with. I make sure that I incorporate that principle. And then with, I guess, Stripe, that was right before GitHub. One of the key things that I've learned is, this is more technical, I guess. Stripe is a business-to-business entity, meaning they build products for other businesses to incorporate. And for them, API first is the mantra. Like you design a product feature, you got to build it out as an API first. That's a great principle to have because customers love it. Like they like to build their own UI, their own automation workflows. And if you don't have APIs, that's where the product fails. And that's something I'm trying to incorporate more at GitHub. GitHub has APIs, but I'm trying to see if I can get my teams to think about API first as we build products out for our large enterprise customers.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to pivot back to pulling some really good questions from the chat, and I'm going to do my best to let's answer as many of these as we can with the time remaining. So Daniel Lozano asked a good question that I think everyone can benefit from, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. But we're looking for advice for candidates that are interviewing, right? And Jacob, you touched on this earlier, some of the things that you look for a candidate to be flexible on their technology, to be flexible on learning new things and not just being an expert at one thing, right? But what is some advice that you could give some folks that might be coming to interview at GitHub? And specifically, would you say technical skills are more important, like tech stack and languages, or are fundamental soft skills more important? Or basically, give us what you look for. So, folks are taking the time to be here, they want to learn. So giving us your insight on what you look for in a candidate when you're interviewing a candidate. And I'd love to hear from each of you on this one.
Sure. I mean, I think the majority of our hiring loops, if you will look similar. They'll typically have, I want to say, like 2 more technical interviews. You're going to be expected to code, right? So first advice is make sure you've brushed up on that, right? Like if you haven't coded recently, do it, right? Do some sample coding, make sure you're comfortable with that, because you will be asked to do that. And then there's one, typically maybe more kind of combination behavioral design type question, right? They can vary a little bit depending on role to role, but largely I would say, yeah, at the end of the day, we're a technology company, and especially in engineering, at least, right? We're hiring engineers that can come in and be productive, right? That doesn't mean you have to know any specific language. And so I would say come in and pick a tool set that you're maybe comfortable with, right? And if somebody asks you a question that's like, oh, how would you do this in Ruby? And you don't know Ruby, no one should ask you that, and you should speak up and say, yeah, I don't know Ruby, but I can answer in Java or in Python or in whatever, right? So be comfortable in what you're comfortable with. Don't try to be something that you're not, right? Just because maybe that, yeah, our monolith is Ruby, that you're going to try to, I've seen people make that mistake where they hear, oh, well, they're really into Go or they're really into Ruby, and they try to teach themselves that in like a short order of time instead of just showing up as experts in whatever they are really good at. We're not looking for specific skills like that from a tool set standpoint. So be yourself would be the other kind of big advice that I would give. And the last thing that I generally say for anybody is think out loud. If you're stuck on something, think out loud, like speak up, say what's going through your head. The interviewer isn't there to try to trick you. They're not there to they're not looking to not hire you. That's not their goal, right? They want you to have a great experience. They want to help you get through it. They're looking to evaluate you. And if you're stuck on something, they're not getting anything out of that. And so they're absolutely willing to help you pass whatever thing you're stuck on. And then after that, you might shine on the rest of it, right? Like all of us might not just understand the question, or maybe it's just not coming to us. It's totally okay, right? It's about making progress. And so, like I said earlier, being willing to ask and say, I'm not really sure what to do here. Can you give me a hint? Or I'm missing it. Like, what's the next step here? Don't be afraid to do that in an interview, right? Because you've got a short amount of time. And if you kind of waste it for too long, then that's not going to be beneficial to anybody.
Super great advice. I think it speaks to the culture there at GitHub, and it reminds me of some of the conversations we've had and heard from with our Microsoft as well. So I love it. Okay, I got another good question. There's some pretty deep questions. So this, I think, is a leadership question, and so it's great that we have you all here, all as leaders within GitHub. So the question is, and Gabby, thanks for bringing this one to my attention. How does GitHub balance the need for innovation with maintaining the reliability and security of the platform? So I'm sure that's something that as leaders within GitHub, when you're looking at new features, right, and innovation, you still have to maintain the reliability and security of the platform. So what have you seen within GitHub to balance that?
I mean, I could talk about this one for hours, but I'll try to keep it short. So I mentioned earlier, actually in the chat, maybe not everybody saw it, but we have a team at GitHub called GitHub Next, which is an entire organization essentially dedicated to being creative and innovating, right? And so one way that we do this as a company is we essentially dedicate a significant investment and say, hey, y'all go run ahead, you look at what you think is the future and invest in it, right? And Spark, for example, came from that. Copilot originally came from that team as well. And so that's like one element of how you balance it. You sort of segment it out and say, hey, this is a team that's going to go focus on innovation, and they aren't responsible for the kind of day-to-day operations of GitHub. But that's a relatively small team. And obviously all teams at GitHub want to innovate and they want to sort of add value in that way, right? And not just be doing kind of whatever people might perceive as like boring work or just painful work, right? Toil. And so for me, in my organization, where we're responsible for, among other things, platform and infrastructure, where actually a lot of that toil is, it's really like the focus is on how do we get rid of that toil? How do we, right now, we've got a massive push on automation, right? How do we automate away all the painful things that take time away? And the reason I bring that up is because ultimately a team can't innovate if they don't have the time to innovate, right? If they're spending all their time, we call it internally keeping the lights on, right? Like, what does it cost for a team to just keep the lights on, keep their areas of responsibility healthy? And so the more that we can reduce that and make that self-service and just sort of work and have the tools do the work for us instead of engineers, then you have more opportunity within teams to innovate and be creative and push forward, right? And then I think the last thing I'll say is it does vary from team to team, right? If if you take one of my teams that maybe is running our network infrastructure, they have a lot of kind of that toil work. And so they have maybe little opportunity. And so we're trying to invest in doing that. In other teams where they're already maybe have a healthier balance, they're able to pick up features occasionally that are more innovative features that are intentionally looking at building something new. And then they combine that with, well, we've got this security thing that just came up and we need to go do that work. Or this availability incident we had last week, here's a repair item that came out of that. We need to prioritize that, right? And so because of kind of the agile way in which we operate, you can pick from both buckets, right?
Okay.
And we do, right? We try to balance between the two buckets as much as we can.
Love it. Appreciate the insightful answer there. So I see a question from Sharon Richards in the comments or in the chat, and I'm going to pose this one to Sharanya. So Sharon is an experienced professional. So Sharanya, I want to pull like some information on sort of how you got your foot in the door and what you think it was that helped you land your opportunity at GitHub, considering you were an experienced, seasoned professional when you came to GitHub. So any insight on what you think helped, right? Because a person can go to GitHub's website, submit several applications, goes into the applicant tracking system. They may or may not get an interview. What do you think it was about your experience coming in as a seasoned hire that helped you get your foot in the door at GitHub?
So I'll give some like general things that have worked for me. Again, hopefully that'll help others as well. And I'll touch on the GitHub piece as well. But in general, one thing I strongly believe in is LinkedIn is a great tool. Make sure your profile is up to date and actually reflects what you worked on and what you are working on. And you have that short blurb, so please outline what you believe in and what you're passionate about. That's a great way to advertise yourself because even if you're not actively looking for a job, talent partners, recruiters are constantly looking at LinkedIn to find those potential candidates. So it's always a good thing to keep yourself up to date there. Also make sure that like you update your resume once in a while because you get a hit from a recruiter and an email from them and you want to be ready and like you want to give them the resume and say, yes, I just want to talk to you. The other thing I want to say is when once in a while, even if you're not interested in a job or a job switch, if somebody reaches out to you, explore the opportunity because that tells you what your market value is, because it gives you an opportunity to see what people are looking for in terms of skills, even if you don't end up taking the job, right? Like the point is you at least have the conversation with the recruiter to see what they're looking for. That always tells you where you stand. Are you learning the right skills? Is this the right path forward for you or not? That's one thing. The other thing is make sure that you have mentors outside of your job as well, because mentors are a great way to express interest in maybe exploring new roles because they work in other industries or other companies, and they'll always ping you if something comes up. For me, most of the time, my foot in the door was through my network. A lot of times people have pulled me and said, hey, look, by the way, there's an opportunity here. Do you want to explore? And that's how it started for me. GitHub was a bit different. A recruiter reached out to me, and I wasn't even looking. And that's how the conversation started. And I had a conversation on what the role is about, and it just got me interested. The point there is when someone reaches out, maybe you're not at the point where you want to make the switch, but at least have the initial conversation to see if it interests you or not.
Excellent insight. Really
I would
appreciate it.
love to also jump in there. Something I would also add is submitting the application is your first pathway to get considered for an opportunity. So, Sharon, I hear you loud and clear. You know, sometimes submitting that application can seem a bit overwhelming, and especially if you've done it many a times, it can definitely seem like a daunting task. But that submission is what gets you considered for opportunities when they arise. So please continue to do so. The next application could be that one. And if you don't submit it, you kind of sort of take yourself out of the running.
Absolutely. Gabby, thank you for adding that point because that is critical. So, what I suggested was when you're passively maybe looking for jobs, but if you're actively looking, or even passively, if you find something interesting, don't forget to apply because that's one way to make sure that you're in the pipeline.
One thing I love about the culture that I'm noticing organically is the GitHub appears to be a culture of taking initiative because you all, I want to thank you because you all have been answering some of the questions already in the chat, considering how many that we're getting. So thank you all to the GitHub team for answering some of these questions. Okay,
Anya,
so
Anya had something to say. Will,
Can
sorry.
I
please
just
do.
jump in for a second, Will? Because someone asked something in the chat, and I just think it's so critical to highlight this, is please apply even if you don't meet all the requirements on the application. We're often trying to show our ideal candidate of like, here's like in the best possible world, we'll have everything. If you're meeting a number of the different requirements, to me, that should be a great reason to apply. And then the other reason to me is it is stressful doing interviews, but it becomes less stressful if you do more of them. So it's a skill almost like anything else of how do you keep calm when you know you're being evaluated to some extent. So I think it's totally okay to go in an interview thinking you're not going to get it, but try to learn and try to take it more as a learning opportunity versus like, I must get a job on the other end. So it's often great to do that when you do have a job and you don't feel that pressure. And I just think like it's just something I was really want to highlight because I see so many folks being nervous. And so I think some of these techniques can really help to try to bring that down. Thanks, Will.
No, excellent, excellent, and highly encourage you all to interrupt me if you have something to add.
I'll just add one very quick
Please
thing
do.
that I really
do.
want to make sure that folks heard what Anya just said, right? Like I think it's a personality thing. Sometimes people look at requirements and they think, oh no, there's no way I meet those. That's like, just don't worry about that, right? Like be confident in yourself. You know, how we measure experience, lots of different things are experience, right? So don't worry about that, just apply, right? What's the worst that can happen, right? So definitely don't, you got to take that step. And so I encourage you to do that.
And I've seen some pretty good general questions as well, like the link to apply to opportunities. After the event, we will send a follow-up email to all of our candidates, and we will give you the link to apply for opportunities for sure. So I wanted to make sure you all knew that. So we've got about 5 more minutes, and wow, I'm seeing some. For those of you all that have not asked the question yet, or have not been paying attention to the chat, you might want to take a look at the chat because there's some really good insight, not only what's being shared on camera from our panelists, but our panelists are answering questions in the chat that are really insightful. So, okay, I want to pull another good question from that was pre-submitted before the event. This one actually was directed to Sharanya, and that is, I'm curious to hear about examples where customer feedback has directly influenced your team's engineering priorities or decisions. It's great to see a customer-centric approach. So that was the question directed to Sharanya.
That does happen frequently. So I talked about planning, which is like, you plan for your roadmap based on customer feedback. We at GitHub do, well, some orgs do quarterly planning, which is we figure out what our priorities are for 3 months. And that's what sets the tone for all of the engineering teams for those next 3 months. But sometimes, customers reach out to us and give us feedback on, hey, by the way, this feature doesn't work well for us, or can you please add this so that it simplifies our administrative workflow, or just in their, usual work environment. That happens. What we do then is, this is where engineering and product. So product is, these are our partners that help us define what the product shape needs to look like. They work very closely with engineering. And when a customer feedback comes to us, engineering and product basically collaborate together to understand if the feedback can wait or if it needs to be prioritized compared to whatever we did for that 3-month plan. And based on that, we make a decision on whether to disrupt the roadmap or not. It's usually a collaborative approach. And it's not black and white that we always say we're not going to disrupt anything. We do disrupt things quite a bit. Like, for example, we had one customer reach out to us where they were not very happy with how frequently our SSO prompts get shown. And that was something we realized was very disruptive to their workflow. So we ended up fixing it because it was a 1 week, it was a short, scope to work. And we were able to pick it up and address the customer feedback, and we have a happy customer. So it does happen.
Awesome example. Love it. Okay, so we've got about 4 minutes left before we need to close out. So I wanted to address next steps, right? So, but first of all, let me thank the GitHub team, Gabby, all of our panelists. We really appreciate you all taking the time out to not only share your experiences, to introduce yourself, tell your stories, but also to shed some behind the scenes look at the culture at GitHub, the opportunities at GitHub, and to give them an idea of just what some of the people at GitHub are like, and can imagine, working with a team with folks like yourself. So we really appreciate that. And to our candidates, we have to thank you all as well for taking the time out to come to the event to learn more about GitHub. And we're excited and we're hopeful that many of you will land interviews and be hired at GitHub. So this is not our first engagement with GitHub. We've done events in the past with GitHub, and we're super excited about you all landing opportunities. So I have a couple of notes here about next steps. We will definitely follow up via email, where you can go and apply for opportunities at GitHub, of course, but also you can expect to receive an email from the GitHub talent acquisition team. So Gabby, feel free to interrupt me if you'd like to add anything onto my notes here. But of course, HBCU Connect will follow up with next steps as well. We've shared your email, your resume. If you don't have your latest resume uploaded through hbcuconnect.com/GitHub, make sure to do that, because we will share a final list of resumes from all of you, that were invited to attend the event. We'll share that with the GitHub team. And then also we're going to ask that you submit the post-event survey. So Louisa, if you're here, if you could drop the link to the survey, because that will help us do these events better and better and continue to provide opportunities like this to more diverse professionals. So Gabby, if you have anything else to add.
Yes, well, you said it so eloquently. Thank you to our panelists from GitHub for joining us today, and thank you all for attending this event. Your questions have been stellar, and I couldn't type fast enough in some of the responses, but it really was energizing and exciting to hear from all of you today, and to really shed some light into who we are here at GitHub outside of the platform, but rather the human aspects. And we appreciate the time that you all took to join us this evening or afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. As Will mentioned, there will be a follow-up message that will be sent, so please keep an eye out for that in your inbox. But if you have any questions or need further information, please do not hesitate to reach out. I know there were a number of questions that we didn't get answered. We're more than happy to take that back, draft some answers, and share it with our HBCU Connect team so that as many questions as we can get answered. But ultimately, thank you all so much again for your time and your interest in learning more about us here at GitHub. And we really hope that you have a great remainder of your day or evening.
Yes, thanks again.
Thank you.
And, you know, from a developer's perspective, this was super awesome. I think, you know, the culture of the company is kind of shining through, and you know, GitHub looks to be an awesome place to work. So to our candidates, definitely take advantage of this opportunity, and follow up, give us your latest resume, and we'll share it with the GitHub team. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Again, thanks again to the GitHub team for taking the time out. And to our candidates, best of luck to you, and definitely let us know if you land an interview or get an offer. Appreciate it.
Thank you for all of your insight, guys. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Thanks for spending some time with us.
Thank you all.
Absolutely.